All right, we're live. What's up, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of My Endurance Live. Um, Tonight's topic is super cool. It's how to transition from road running to trail running, and I'm super excited to introduce our guest to you, Joe Corcione. If you're new to the group or watching the replay live on or watching on YouTube, then I'm Eric Schroeder. I'm a USCO ultra running certified coach, and I love running, talking about running, and helping other runners become better runners. Every week, I go live in the Minders Life Facebook group and share on a topic of interest to help everybody in the group set goals and achieve their goals. Other ways I like to help our community is by bringing in special guests like Joe to share on topics of interest. If you don't know who Joe is, he's an ultra runner, ultra running coach, and a host of the Everyday Ultra podcast. Joe went from no running or sports background to the top 10 male at Javelina Jundred. If you don't guys don't know what that race is, it's like one of the most competitive 100-mile races out there. So it's super fast. It's super fast. And then also Joe has competed in numerous 100-mile races and various cross races across the country. How did he do this? He did it by diving deep into ultra running science and application to help him level up to be a competitive runner. Now Joe's mission is to help ultra runners and aspiring ultra runners to be the best endurance athlete they can by sharing everything he's learned across his journey. He does this by coaching ultra runners to hit their biggest goals and without sacrificing other important priorities in their life, which is super key because ultra running takes up a lot of time. So that's super huge. And by through his podcast, Everyday Ultra. All of Joe's links are listed in the description, so give him a follow and be sure to check out his podcast. It's by far one of the best ultra running podcasts out there and my go-to for my long runs. Ultra running podcasts in general are either super informative but boring or pure entertainment and you really don't learn much, but Joe does a great job of combining entertainment and educating us along the way, so that's what keeps me coming back. So for those of you who don't check links, how to get a hold of you, Joe?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for the introduction, man. That was incredible. I appreciate that a ton, and all the kind words like means a lot. And first of all, you nailed it on the head with like Everyday Ultra. Like I wanted to kind of bridge the gap between informative and applicable, but not putting people to sleep. And I have fun, but I'm not like over the top silly where you're like, what the heck is that? So that's the middle ground we're going for. So hearing that is amazing. But anyways, where to find me? I'm most active on Instagram at Joe Corcione. You can reach out to me, send me a DM. But also too, if you want to probably get a quicker response from me, best way is email everydayultrapodcast@gmail.com. And you can check out the Everyday Ultra podcast on whatever platform you listen to, Spotify, Apple, Google, whole nine yards from there. And we release episodes every week. So stoked to be here. And thanks again for everything, Eric.
Yeah, definitely. So every week, like to uh, recognize the runners in our group who ran over the weekend. And hey, what's up? As we take a minute to recognize the group members who raced over the weekend, I want to personally invite you to join the My Endurance Life Facebook group. You can get there by going to myendurancelife.com, click on the blue button that says join the group, and you'll get an invitation to join right now. Then you can get free live training like you're watching right now with Joe and I, and access to free training guides and all kinds of resources, myendurancelife.com, and then join the group. See you guys soon. Bye. So with that being said, let's get into tonight's training.
Sweet. Well, I'm excited to be here and congrats to everybody who ran races and congrats to everybody too who's out there training and running and getting it in. As a runner myself, I know how much dedication and time and energy and effort and passion it takes to be out there training all the time. So kudos to everybody who's racing, training, or is even just on here learning today, right? It's just super, super cool because we're going to talk about a really, really awesome subject that's close and near and dear to my heart, and that's how to transition from the road to trail, right? Now, a lot of the times, right, I think, when I'm coming in my background, I only ran on road exclusively. And by the way, I only ran on road exclusively even when I was training for my first trail race. I never got on the trail. And I will just tell you first thing, and we'll get all to the application things, is that if you're road running for a trail race only, you want to probably get a little bit of trail in there. And I'll explain that in a bit. But besides just from the difference in terrain and the difference of, elevation and all the kind of obvious things that kind of come along, there's a real key differences that I see a lot of people, including myself, when I first made the transition transition, made mistakes on when moving from road to trail, that I'm here to help you to prepare that way. So even if you are maybe going for your first trail race, or maybe you're a road runner and you want to set up the building blocks to success to eventually go into a trail race, whether it is a trail, half marathon, marathon, ultra, anything like that, I'm going to give you the keys to success to do so on there as well. So I guess before we dive into this, like a little bit about my background, as Eric kind of mentioned on there too. So I have like virtually no running experience growing up. I'm not the typical person who, went through, I ran cross country and then I ran track and like I did all this stuff in college. Like none of that. Like the only sport that I played in high school, and I use that air quotes intentionally, was golf. And I can say that golf is a sport because I play golf and I think I get a pass at that. But I never played any team sports or anything else like that. So, and then as Eric mentioned too, I placed top 10 at Javelina Jundred, which is a very competitive 100-mile race here in the US 2 years ago. And then this past year, I placed in the top 20. It was a lot more competitive of a field, but the point is not the result. The point is, going from someone who was unathletic to an ultra runner. And the other big point I make is that there's nothing special about me. Everybody has the ability to do that. And so the thing that I like to do, and what I put through on the Everyday Ultra podcast, and why I'm here today, here with all of you endurance athletes, is because I truly believe that humans can become anyone that they want to be as long as they're willing to put in the work and learn. And if you're on here, you're already doing one of those things. You're already learning. And as I'm hearing from Eric with all the races y'all are doing, like you're putting in the work too. So before we even get into the difference between road and trail running, I want y'all to know, if you want to go from a road to a trail runner, you totally can. And that's actually step number one, is just believing that you can change, right? I think a lot of the times when people are hesitant to move into the trail world, or maybe they're unsure of what they need to do, they identify as a road runner, or I only run on roads, or making these statements like that. Now, and you say, I'm not a trail runner. Instead of saying I'm not a trail runner, say I'm not a trail runner yet. And just know that there's a possibility that all you need to do, the gap between where you are from a road runner now to a trail runner, is just a matter of skills and a matter of learning and knowledge. And that's really it. And once you apply those learning and knowledge into the training techniques that I'm going to go through and tell you here today, it's going to be helping you to get there too. And just know that that principle just doesn't apply from road to trail. It applies from non-running to running. It applies from half marathon runner to a marathon runner. It applies from a marathon runner to a 100-mile runner, 100-mile to, right? Whatever you want to be in your life in the running world, you can, as long as you're willing to learn and put in the work. So that's the big overarching thing. You're like, geez, Joe, I thought we were here to talk road to trail. I didn't think you were here to give me a whole life sermon, but hey, I think it's the most important principle to think about when you're making a big change like that. So that's the first important thing that I want to mention. Now, before I go into the other things that you really need to get into, what are the biggest differences between road and trail? Now, number one is the obvious, right? The terrain. The terrain is different, but besides just the dirt and the rocks and the things that you're probably going to run into on the trail, there's other factors in there that really, really play a role in as well. And the first thing is the unevenness in terrain. And the reason why that is so important is because if we think about when you're running on a road, right, generally for the most part, it's pretty flat and your foot is going to have that same strike pattern, so on and so forth throughout that entire time. Now, when you get on a trail, of course, there's going to be dirt, there might be roots, there might be rocks, depending on where you're running, but now your foot is going to be moving a little bit more like this. Now, why does that matter? It matters for several different reasons. The first reason is it requires a lot more stability, it requires a lot more balance, and it also requires a lot more strength and a lot of your stabilizing muscles like your quads, your calves, everything like that, in order to get the same amount of energy output that you need on a trail and also to stay afloat. I've been trail running for also 5 years too. And by the way, like I don't always stay afloat. Sometimes I trip and I fall. And so I'm not saying you're going to get that down perfectly, but it's something to keep in mind. And so we'll talk about how to adapt to those things, but that's the first thing to keep in mind. And that's very important because the foot strike is different, which also means too, we hear this term a lot in road running, running economy. Running economy is king, right? We think about why people wear the Alpha Fly or the Vapor Fly or the Saucony Endorphins, right? A lot of these shoes, because they're designed to optimize running economy. Running economy in the world of trail running really doesn't matter as much, especially the more technical the trail gets, especially because it's so variable with the foot strikes. So that's a big thing to keep in mind. The second thing relates to that first point, is trails are generally slower than the road. They're generally slower all the time. I remember when I first did my first trail run after road running for so long, I went out on the trail and I was like, why am I running so much slower? It's because there's more stuff in the way. It's a little bit more variable and everything like that too. So as we'll kind of talk about in the trail thing, it's good to know that, because I always say, like, don't expect the same splits that you have on the road as you do on the trail. Now, if the trail's a dirt road or the trail's like super buffed and super like just, smooth out, you can expect pretty similar terrain. But for most traditional trails where you have roots and rocks and things along the way, it's going to be a little bit slower. So that's just something to keep in mind as well, and a big difference between that too. The third thing is there's probably going to be a lot more undulation in terms of the ups and downs that you're going to face. Now, if you live in an area like Florida or you live in the Midwest, probably going to get a lot more dead flat stuff. But I've even seen in those places, you might get some rolling hills and ups and downs. And a lot of the traditional trail races that you see across the country are generally going to have some forms of ups and downs and everything like that, right? Now, we all know the Boston Marathon, right? There's Heartbreak Hill, right? And Heartbreak Hill, if I'm thinking about it off the top of my head, I think it's anywhere between like 400 to 600 to 800 feet, somewhere around that frame. There are some trails out here in Arizona where you're doing climbs that are 1,000 feet in less than a mile. So like, the undulation in these trails can be very, very hard, which is very important, not just from an effort perspective, but again, from a biomechanic perspective on how you're running, because you're activating different muscles, you're using different patterns, your foot is striking in a different way. When you're going downhill, that also has a lot more muscular damage on the quads. So these are all just things to consider as well. And when you're also going from road to trail too. So I would say those are the biggest things by far and by none on that as well. Now, and by the way, Eric, if you see any questions that pop up, like, feel free to like put your finger up. I'm happy to answer this. And by the way, anyone here, I want to make this interactive. Like, listen, I'm a podcaster. I love to talk on the podcast, but I want to have a conversation with y'all too. So if you have any questions throughout, definitely let me know.
Yeah, no,
So,
Brandon just mentioned that her brother knows you, and he ran the Cocodona 250 last year. So
oh, nice.
he's saying hi.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, dude, congrats on Cocodona. That is amazing. And yes, hello, Brandon. Like, good to have you here, man. And yes, I'm training for Cocodona too, which is also 250-mile road race. Very scary, but that is besides the point. So, anyways, good to see you, Brandon. Thanks for reaching out. But anywho, so how do we make the transition from road to trail? Now, I always say the biggest thing, first and foremost, like when you're making the transition from road to trail, and this one's very, very important, is introduce trail in gradual increments. And what I mean by that is, if you're running, even if you're running, 20-mile long runs on the road, don't make your first trail runs the 20-mile runs. And here's the reason why. It's just the same reason of why you wouldn't start strength training. And then if you haven't strength trained in a while, you'd get underneath the bench press and then you just load up 3 plates and start to go from there, right? It's the same reason why too, if you've taken some time off from running an injury, your first run back is not going to be 20 miles. We need to do progressive overload. And if you remember the key differences that I mentioned before, not just in the terrain, but how our muscles adapt to the trails, it's going to be very, very different, right? Because now we're activating different muscles. We're going uphill, we're going downhill, we're navigating more technical terrain. Our stride's going to change. All those things are different. Now, if we go on a 20-mile run as our first trail run, and now we have all these variables in a way, and now our muscles are dancing and grooving and jiving in different ways that they never grooved and jived before, you have an actually increased risk for injury, because now you're actually working these muscles that aren't as used to moving and shaking around in the way that they're used to, and there actually is a chance of that. So a lot of the times, like when I see road runners going to trail and they jump in right away off the bat, they're like, why is my Achilles hurting so much more? Why are my calves like so much tighter? Why are my quads so much tighter? Like, I'm running the same amount of miles, but now I'm on this stupid trail and now I'm hurting a lot more. It's because your muscles are working a lot more differently. So I always say, put it in increment amounts. And so what I generally say is, look at your smallest runs of the week and then put those smaller runs as your trail runs, and then save the longer runs in the short term to the road and the terrain that you're currently training on as well. You want to introduce it gradually. And then you want to probably increase your mileage, and anywhere between 5 to 10% in terms of like a weekly basis of what you're doing on the trail in that increments as well. Now, of course, right, you want to train and trail as much as possible if you're signed up for a trail race. And let's just say you're a road runner and you sign up for a trail race in 2 months and you never had the time to go in there. I still suggest doing it gradually as well, and doing it as much as possible to get into it, not just in one bout of like 20 miles and things like that, but do it on all of your shorter runs, right? Like, that's like a big thing on there as well. And then once you get more comfortable and your body gets more adapted closer to the race, then you can do your long runs on trails. But you want to progressively overload the trail exposure, just like you would progressively overload your training, your mileage week by week, the weights that you're having on strength training, right? All these things, you want to do that the same way with trail. So that is the first thing on there. The second thing is you want to make sure you have the right shoes. This is a big mistake that I see a lot of people make. Now, you don't have to necessarily have a trail shoe. That's another big myth that I see in the trail running world, is that if you're running on trails, you have to do trail shoes. There's some road shoes that actually do pretty well on trail. But here is the point that I'm trying to make. The point that I'm trying to make is that most trail shoes have traction on the bottom. They have lugs, whereas most road shoes are pretty much dead flat on the bottom. Those lugs on the bottom of a trail shoe can grip onto rocks a lot better. They're going to have much more traction when it comes to keeping your feet on the ground when you're running as well. And they're going to be better for uphill and downhill efficiency when you're having more stickiness on the ground as well. So I highly suggest, don't take those pairs of Alpha Flies and go in on a very rooty and rocky trail. Look into a good pair of trail shoes. Now, listen, I can sit here and I can say different brands and types of shoes that I would suggest, but here's the reality. The reality is find the trail shoe that's best for you. And that's the same for road running too, is everyone's different. Everyone's different in terms of how they react to stack height and lug size and everything like that. So I always suggest, going to your local shoe store, specifically a shoe specialty store, because I think they have a lot better advice when it comes to that too. And they can help you to find the best trail shoe for your needs, and you can go out and try and find the most comfortable thing. Now, if you go on your road shoe on your local trails and find that it's fine, you feel comfortable with that, that's totally cool too. But I highly suggest at least getting a pair of trail shoes just so you can see the difference and make that decision afterwards. Because if you wear a pair of Alpha Flies out on a very rocky and technical trail, either you might fall, or number two, those shoes are going to get absolutely destroyed because they're not made for that terrain. So that's another suggestion that I have there as well. Now,
Can I add to the shoes real quick? So
100%.
another good thing about trail shoes versus road shoes is they have a better toe protection, because you're
Yes.
gonna be stubbing your toes a lot. Especially if you're brand new to trails. I don't know how many times I tripped out there. And like Joe was saying, I was in my pair of road running shoes when I first started. It was like I black and blued my toes and my toenails just because I was tripping so much. But lots of brands do make lots of trail shoes that have like a middle traction, like middle of the road, more prone for like easy fire roads or transitioning from trails to road. They're not super aggressive in the lug pattern.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, great call out on that toe thing too. Yeah, because your toes are gonna smash a lot into the shoes, and you want to have that protection out there in case you catch a rock or a root or anything like that. Pro tip too on the trail side of things too, and this is different than the road stuff, but on the trails, because your foot is going to be banging around a lot more, there is more inclination for swelling in your feet when you're out there as well too. So here's a little bit of a pro tip: is take your normal shoe size and maybe go up by at least a half a size, at max most a size, because there's many times in an ultra marathon or a trail run where my feet have actually swelled up a little bit more. And also too, like, not only do you get that protection if your feet do swell, but at the same time, if you are hitting the front of the shoe as much as possible, if you have a little bit more room, you have a little bit more wiggle room to not go ahead and basically get that in there as well. I will say too, with trails, there's also a bigger risk for blisters as well, because your foot is moving around in all these weird and different ways as well. So if you are someone that is prone to blisters, what I highly suggest is one of two things, or both. The first thing is getting what I call blister powder. Actually, I shouldn't say I call it, it's what it is called. But basically, if you look on and you go to Amazon, you just search blister powder. All it is I think it's the stuff that I specifically use is called Blister Shield. But you put it into your socks, you put it in there, and it's going to take all the moisture away. Because without getting too into the nitty gritty on blisters, moisture and heat and friction are the three things that cause it. If you can take out the moisture, even when you're sweating a lot, that's going to help. And that's what the powder does. That's going to help a lot with that as well. And then the second thing you could do is also pre-tape your feet with Leukotape, which there's many videos that'll show you the technique to do it. It's besides this conversation, but blisters are definitely one thing that shocks a lot of people from going from the road to the trail.
Yeah.
And again, because your feet are moving around a lot. So that's definitely a big thing on there as well. But anyways, enough about feet stuff on here. The third thing to really practice is the uphills and the downhills. And honestly, a lot more people get scared with the uphills than they do the downhills. But I think the downhills is something that people need to be more aware of when it comes to road running. And here's why. When they look at ultramarathon runners and they look at what the big causes of muscular fatigue and damage are, especially in the longer trail races, the impact and the fatigue on the legs is actually not so much coming from the flat and the uphill stuff, but mostly the downhill running. Downhill running actually increases the amount of force that is coming back into your body. So when you're running on flat roads or flat trail, whatever that might be, the impact that you're getting onto your body is about 2 times your body weight. When you're going uphill, that impact is actually less, because think about running uphill, right? It's more pitter patter. You're not kind of slamming down as much. So therefore, the impact forces coming back are going to be less than 2 times your body weight. But now think about when you're running downhill. When you're running downhill, you're slamming that thing a lot more. And now your impact force is going to be a lot bigger. And you're going to have a lot more prone to having more muscle damage in your quads as well. So I always suggest, if you are signed up for a trail race and there is ups and downs, specifically downhill, get comfortable with running downhill. And now I don't mean go through on a downhill run and just bomb it as hard as possible. That is actually counterproductive, and don't do that. But get some practice for that specific race. And generally, when we're working with athletes, so I'm also a coach as well, I work with athletes. When I'm working with athletes, what I do is I take their goal trail race that they have, and let's just say this is the first time they've ever ran trails, they've run road before. What I would essentially do is I would structure a lot of their runs that they're doing on trail to have a very similar feet per mile distribution as the race itself, right? So let's just look, I'm just pulling a random race out, for example, Zion 100 has about 10,000 feet of climbing over 100 miles. And again, it's a nice number sake here. What I would do is I would take the elevation number, divide it by the amount of miles. So that would be 100 feet per mile. And then I would tell the athlete, and this is something that you can do for a race, and saying like, okay, I have my long run on Saturday. This race I'm training for is about 100 feet per mile. That's what I'm trying to get in my long run. Now, not to be confused with actually literally getting in 100 feet per mile, over the cumulative amount of the route that you are running. So if you are running about, let's just say 10 miles, you should be looking to get, about 1,000 feet of gain, right? 1,000 feet of gain. And then what I would also do is match the elevation profile to the race as much as possible as you can by looking at that specific distance. Now, this is getting a little bit into the nitty gritty here, but I know some people might be like, hey, I live in Florida and I'm training for Leadville, or hey, I'm training for a trail race and I'm flat. Then I always say either one of two things. Number one, find your local hill and do some hill repeats up those, because that will get the job done. Or number two, and a lot of people hate me for this, but I'm telling you it'll help, is the good old treadmill. And then you say, hey, how is the treadmill helping me for the trails? It won't necessarily help from the technicality perspective, but what it will do, it will train you for the uphill and also downhill if you have a treadmill that can do downhill, with the same biomechanics of running as well, to get your body more adapted with it as well. So I always say, train for the uphills, train for the downhills as well. Because a lot of people, when they think of elevation, they automatically go, I need to train climbing. They neglect the downhill, and then their quads get fried out on the downhill. And then they're wondering, why am I so sore? I tried all these climbing. It's because the downhill was neglected in training. So that's also a very, very big thing as well. Any questions so far? We still got some tips here, but any questions so far coming in?
Yeah, no, we're good right now.
Cool. Awesome. So that is the thing as well. Now, the fourth thing is training for the technicality, right? So, one of my favorite jokes of all time is from the late great Robin Williams, rest in peace. And he does this skit all the time of, saying the difference between bowling and golf, right? They're like, why don't we just make golf like bowling? He's like, oh, well, golf, like there's just a bunch of stuff in the way, right? There's water, there's all this stuff as well. I consider trail running a very equivalent to that too, of where there's just a bunch of stuff in the way. There's rocks, there's roots and everything like that. And you need to be more mindful in your steps. So this is the biggest tip that I can give you in terms of start going on the trail, is run a little slower. Now, you might want to go out there and rip it. But again, don't put your speed workouts on this day. Don't put your faster efforts on the trail day. Put your easier efforts and go slow to start. And the reason why I say that is because if you're used to running on a road where there's not a lot of stuff, with roads, you can pretty much check out, like for the most part, right? You can check out for the most part. You don't have to think about it. You can kind of disassociate as much. Whereas a trail running, you have to be very, very hyper aware of your surroundings, especially the more technical the trails get. So because of that, you can't approach the trail the same way as the road and just check out. You really got to be mindful of your surroundings, for the roots, for the rocks and everything like that. And so what I suggest for your first few trail runs is do a few different things. First thing is go slower, as I mentioned before. Go slower. Don't expect to have the same pace. You shouldn't be going at the same pace unless it's a very buffed out trail, but we're assuming a relatively, at least, more technical than a road, which is most trails in general. Go slower out there. If you go too fast, you will likely fall. And sometimes if you fall on a trail, depending on where you're at, it can be pretty gnarly. I run out here in Arizona. It's a very rocky and dry trail. If you take a bad bite going on one of these trails, you can seriously mess yourself up and be out of the gate running for a little bit. That's something you want to avoid. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and I know I might get a lot of people being like, oh man, like Joe, I don't like you have to say in this one. I would just ditch the music for a little bit. Like you want to be present, you want to be around your surroundings, and guess what? You're in nature. Like take a look around, like enjoy it. Like it's incredible. Like you're outside, like in the woods. Like I remember the first time I started trail running, I started to imagine myself as like a cheetah, like running through the forest and stuff. Not running as fast as a cheetah, but I like to think that way. But anyways, jokes aside and stuff, take like the beauty in the surroundings, but most importantly, taking out the music is going to also help to give you more spatial awareness, because if you're listening to music, it actually does impact your vision a lot more. And so you want to get used to citing those things as well. And then the
And
third thing,
and then also to the point about not listening to music or anything is you can hear your foot strike and you can hear how efficient your foot strike is just by how much noise you're making. And like good runners are quiet runners. So especially like going downhill, like if you hear yourself just pounding and pounding, chances are you're probably like overstriding and just like really smacking the ground like too hard, just going to translate all the way back up through your body and just tear it up.
yeah,
So.
great call in there as well. Yeah, like, and that's a great drill to do too, is what's quiet running, especially on the downhill techniques, is going down and trying to make your steps as quiet as possible. That is a great thing too. So also too, listening to your foot strike, as Eric mentioned, is a great tip too. So yeah, no, appreciate you chiming in on that, Eric, as well. And then the other thing to kind of put into perspective, like when it comes to the different trail runnings, is honestly like, and this can be a little controversial, especially when coming out of the road world, but they did a study on various different ultra running athletes. One of them, they actually looked at Kilian Jornet, who, if you know the name, you probably know the name Kilian if you run. Probably the greatest runner, ultra runner of our generation. I shouldn't say runner, but greatest ultra runner of our generation. And they did a study on his foot patterns when he was running. And what they noticed with him and also other very successful ultra running athletes is they actually modified their foot strikes throughout the different areas. Now, all the time when we think of running economy, we think of like, heel strike bad, forefoot or midfoot strike is great. But in trail running, there's can actually be a little bit more use for that. And why is that? Think about what I mentioned earlier on. The terrain is very variable. And so you can experiment with how your foot is going down in different ways, because what that's going to do also too is spread out the different ways that your muscles are activated so that you can have much more longevity out there as well. And trail running makes that a lot more friendlier than the road, because the surfaces are a lot more different. You're hopping over boulders, you're climbing over things, like you're going uphill a lot more. You can experiment with those things as well. But that is something that I would do probably later on once you're more comfortable with the trail and the sighting and stuff like that. But that's always a big difference that a lot of people, when they hear that, they're like, oh my God, like, what are you telling me to heel strike? No, I'm not telling you to heel strike, but I'm saying like get a little bit more comfortable with placing your foot in different ways. Unlike a road where every stride is basically the same, in a trail, you might be like, loosening up your legs a little bit, might be like, going a little bit shorter steps in some areas, right? Experimenting with those things out there to find your perfect stride for the various terrains that you are training for out there in a way that's going to help a ton. So that is a big thing to also keep in mind as well. The other thing too, here's another big difference between road and trail running too, especially when it comes to the incline. And how we're doing on time, Eric, just so I know.
Oh, we're good. Yeah, we're good. Yeah.
Perfect.
Mhm.
Here's like a big thing that I see a lot of people kind of screw up, and this is more so for the longer distances, right? And I'm talking like anywhere between, marathon and up, is that if there is more climbing and descending in your ultra marathon or marathon, whatever you're doing on the trail, even just a trail in general, you might have to actually intake more fluids and more calories,
Mhm.
right? You're like, what the heck? What does terrain have to do with that? Well, think about it. As we mentioned before, the terrain's very variable. You're going to be using a lot more muscles in there. If you're having a lot more climbing actually burns off calories a lot more than if you were running on flat terrain. And a lot of times people will take their marathon fueling strategy, which could be anywhere between, 200 to 250 calories an hour. And then they go onto the trails and all of a sudden they're like, why am I bonking with the same amount of intake? It's because now that there's climbing in there, you're burning a lot more calories and your body's going to require a lot more to do it. So when I'm usually work with athletes who are transitioning from road to trail, I usually like to do a deep dive audit on what they are doing nutritionally. And more times than not, we actually up their nutrition amount because they're going to be working a lot more harder on the trail than they are the roads as well. So that's a big variable to kind of go into it as well. And so that's a big thing too, is just your fueling you and your hydration. You're probably going to want to up the intakes up a little bit, especially if you're going out in your first few long trail runs and you notice you're a little bit more bonkier than usual, probably going to have to up that up as well. Now, the last big tip that I have on here, and this comes with training as well, and this also, it can be somewhat controversial, but it is the gold standard in ultra running specifically, and I think it also translates well to trail as well, is that this. If you are training on heart rate when it comes to roads, I would suggest being more open to not looking at the heart rate on trail. And I'm sure there's a lot of people watching this who's like, I've trained a heart rate my whole life. Like, why does it translate to trail? The difference between road to trail, think about all the differences, right? There's so many different variables in there. And because there's so many different variables in trail running, that is going to have a lot more variable on your heart rate as well. For road running, heart rate is actually a decent metric to look at because it's very controlled, it's very stable, there's not a lot of variables in the way. But then when you get to trail, there's technicality, there's uphill, there's downhill, there's heat exposure for being out a little bit longer, right? There's all these different variables to kind of go into effect when it comes to training. So when it comes to the trails, you can still run on the roads if doing a heart rate perspective if you'd like to. There's no problem with that. But when it gets to the trail, I usually like to prescribe athletes by going off of perceived effort. Now, we won't get into too much of the weeds of perceived effort, but basically it is ranking your workouts on a scale of 1 to 10 based on how it feels, 1 being the least intense, 10 being the most intense. And basically what you do is saying, hey, today, I'm going to do this trail run at a 2 to 3 RPE, right? Or if you want to get a little bit more spicier, you can do something called like steady state intervals where you have like 4 to 5 RPE intervals gradually throughout, and you can save those for hills right in there as well. Or you can say, hey, I'm going to have a 2 to 5 RPE workout. I'm going to run 5 on the uphills, and then the downhills and flats, I'm going to run a 2 out of 3, right? So those are things that you can kind of go into there. But I always suggest making the shift to RPE because a lot of people will go on the trail and they're running maybe the similar pace that they're doing on the road, and they look down at their heart rate and they're like, why is this higher? Again, your body's working a lot harder, but in the end of the day, like heart rate is an indication of all the variables in there, not necessarily the running as well. And so sometimes those variables can play the heart rate a little bit more accurate relative to how you feel out there. So that's why the gold standard for ultra running and trail running is going off of RPE, rate of perceived effort, instead of heart rate as well. So I would say you can eventually go into a heart rate perspective once you get more familiar with your heart rate on the trails. But I would say start going on RPE because, again, if you go out on the trails and you're like, well, I can't get my heart rate, below 130, no matter how hard I try, it can be easy to get discouraged or feel like it is not for you. But I always say just go by perceived effort, and you have one less metric to really think about and tie your head to too. So those would be the biggest tips that I have in terms of going from road to trail. So just to kind of summarize everything on here, number one, the first thing is go slower and practice just taking a rein in the surroundings. Go slower. Don't expect the same pace. Don't wear music. Don't wear headphones. Just get used to get comfortable with the trail. And like I always think about like, I don't even know, like a sensei like going to me and be like, be the trail. I don't know. Just like imagine like you're in the Karate Kid or something and Mr. Miyagi's telling you to be the trail, right? Like that's what you really want to do in the first thing. Second thing is experiment with shoes, particularly with trail shoes, right? The road shoe that you're running on, especially if it's an Alpha Fly or Vaporfly, might not be working as much on the trail as well. So that's the second thing on there too. Third, prepare for the uphills and the downhills, and don't skip those downhill trainings. And that could be by just matching the elevation feet per mile in the race that you're training for with the trails that you're going on. Or if you don't have trails near you that can do that, simulate that with the treadmill, uphill and downhill as well, or find a local hill where you can run up and down. Interestingly enough, like one of the top 10 runners at Western States a couple years ago, Arlen Glick, he actually finished third. So on the podium, he lives in Ohio, which is like dead flat. And I would always be so fascinated with his Strava because he would do like a street out by his house. It was called like Deerfield or something. And literally the Strava was just like one line. And it would be like 13 miles and 5,000 feet of elevation gain. And he would do these like 13, 15-mile runs just going up and down this thing over and over again just to get the vert and gain. So don't think that if you live in a flat area, you can't get it done. Like I've seen it done, which is awesome. And so, and someone from who's a very successful mountain runner who lives in a flat area. So prepare for those things as well. The fourth thing to know too, as I mentioned before too, is, experiment with your foot strikes a little bit, right? Because it doesn't have to be that same perfect foot strike that looks like an Eliud Kipchoge out there or anything like that, right? the greats like Killian Jornet, Jim Walmsley, Courtney DeWalter, they all vary their foot strikes as much as possible. So be sure to vary those foot strikes when you're out there as well, for sure. And then the last thing, as I mentioned before, if you're training on heart rate or you're used to training on heart rate, ultimately, maybe on the first few trail runs, you can go back to heart rate if you really, really want to down the road. But for your first few trail runs, just focus on perceived effort. And that's going to not only just get you more close to the trail as well, but heart rate doesn't necessarily translate over as well to the trails as it does over there as well. And going on RPE is great. And let me tell you, I used to go off heart rate, then I switched to RPE, and I have actually never gone back. Like, I love RPE even when I run on the roads. The last thing that I will say too, if you are making the transition from road to trail, that doesn't mean you never have to run on the road again. I know a lot of us trail runners make the joke all the time. They're like, oh, those roadies, all this stuff, but it's all good fun. Let me tell you, after this call, I'm going out and I'm running on the road because it's much more convenient. Now, so don't think that if you run on the trails that you have to give up the road entirely. The road is still great. And then the road can be great for speed workouts or pace testing. And hey, I know a lot of good ultra runners who do put a road marathon in their training block. So just know that just because you go to the trails doesn't mean you can't hit the road from time to time, and vice versa, right? So it's good to have a little bit of mix of everything on there as well. So just don't think that if you're going to trail running, you have to run on trails all the time. You can still go out on the roads, and you can still go back to a road marathon or a half marathon or anything like that. And there's even road ultras, which, man, like, praise the Lord for anyone who can do that, because that is really it's a lot of pounding on the pavement, which, by the way, benefit of trails, a lot softer on the muscles and the joints. So you're going to have a lot less impact going into your body. But anywho, just know that you're not married to trails for life. But I promise you, if you get into the trails, you will love it. It's one of those things where I haven't heard anyone who's done it said they hate it, and it is a fun journey. So enjoy the adventure, enjoy the sights. And the cool thing is with trail running, make some adventures out of it. Go to a national park and run a trail that maybe takes people 2 or 3 days to do, and you can do it in one day. Go to that epic mountain and like go for a little mountain run out there, and like go to this like remote section that a lot of people don't get to because it's too far by walking, right? Like, trail running allows you to see more and a lot less in some of the coolest places in the world. So take advantage of that, own that, make it cool, make it fun. And that's the most important thing at the end of the day. I can give you all the training tips and techniques and everything, but the most thing is just enjoy it. And I think that's one of the coolest things about trail running. So that's pretty much the little mini class on that as well. If you have any questions too, feel free to reach out to me through email, everydayultrapodcast@gmail.com, Instagram too, but also I'm here with you now. So if you have any questions, let me know, and I'm happy to go through it. So yeah, any questions popping into there, Eric?
No, just want to say it's great information, and thank you so much. So
yeah, man, so happy to help. And
Yeah.
if anyone has any questions too, just feel free to reach out to me. I'm pretty accessible through the interweb, so would love to connect with y'all.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that point about still road running and trail running at the same time, because I actually just finished a marathon block, and now that I'm getting back in the trails, preparing for my ultras coming up, I've noticed that my trail running has improved dramatically. Just because I was doing those speed workouts and focusing on running fast again, because it's like lots of times being a trail and ultra runner, you get stuck in that ultra shuffle, and then it's like running fast. When I first started training again for the marathon, was like super, super uncomfortable. And so it's like, but one thing I noticed too is going from trail running to road running again is like, I actually like look forward to the hills. And when I was only road running, like I used to like just be terrified of them, to be like, but then it just, road running makes you a better trail runner, and trail running makes you a better road runner. So
Yeah, 100%. And that's such a good point. I love that you had that example in there of like putting in that road marathon block to the trail run. And honestly, it's a good place to start too if you're just building fitness, because as I keep mentioning before, a common theme of like kind of the conversation was like there's so many variables in a trail. The thing with the trail, like sometimes like maybe if you're coming off of like a long off season, or maybe like you're injured and you're coming back to things, if you go out and try to go on the local trail and there's some hills on there, even if you're hiking up the hills, you might not be at a low intensity. And so sometimes like just going on the road is a good way just to build sheer base fitness. And I will tell you, coming off of my last training block where I did Javelina Jundred, I went through a huge training block for that, and I took like a month off, and I needed just to build base fitness back. My first runs for Cocodona 250, where you're running on mostly trail, like pretty much like 90% of the time. I think there's like 10% pavement in there, but like 90% of the time, you're running on trail for 250 miles. I was running on roads for most of the beginning thing, specifically because I just wanted that flat, controllable terrain where I
Mhm.
could just lower my intensity as much as possible. And so it's a great way to like actually get, into it. Whereas like trails can actually be a little tougher if you're coming off an off-season period or an injury or stuff like that, because it's just harder to get a little bit more control of your intensity at some parts as well. So just know that
Mhm.
like the road shouldn't be, demonized or being like, no road for me. Like there's a lot of applicable road uses for the road, even if you are a trail runner at heart, even if they
Yeah.
make the full transition.
And it's a lot easier to get people to go with you on a road run.
Oh
So
yeah,
yeah.
100%. I know. I got a lot of my friends where I'm like, hey, you want to go trail run? They're like, no, and I
Mm.
totally get it. But I think we're seeing a growth in trail running, which is
Yeah,
great. I shouldn't say I think,
huge.
I know. And so and I highly suggest it. Like it's funny. One of my buddies who's staunch road runner, we're going on his first trail run next week, and I told him I was like, you're gonna be hooked, man. So just know if you want to get people to go in and get on the trails, like take them somewhere beautiful and get them hooked.
Yeah. So I appreciate your time, Joe. Thank you so much. I'm going to sign off of Facebook here, and yeah, this is awesome.
Yeah, was that useful, man? Was that
Yeah, thank you so
awesome?
much. Yeah,
Yeah,
it was good.
no.
Yeah.
Cool. Are we still live through the group or?
No, we're off of Facebook, so it's just you and
Oh,
me right now.